Hey, welcome back to IDSD 250, the Common Good Practicum. Today we're going to be talking about communitarianism. And if you've made it this far, and if you read Sandel chapters 9 and 10, you have basically finished the last of the hard philosophical thinking of the class. So congratulations. The rest of the class is not as philosophically difficult. So good job. And also, you have a few weeks now to clarify ideas that maybe are confusing. Make sure to keep reviewing and asking questions. Before I jump into today's topic, let me just say a couple things. Number one, I apologize for not returning homework last drop. I came down with a really nasty cold. Apparently, it wasn't COVID-19, thankfully, but it nevertheless knocked me out for 4 days. I'm like halfway back. If I have to cough and stuff during this lecture, I apologize. And that's number one. Number two, if you hear me shaking my fist or see me shaking my fist like this, it's because upstairs is a Holy Cross College dorm room. And I think they're having elephant races because I keep hearing this pounding. And oh well, what am I going to do? 3, you need your handout. Okay, look at the back of the handout. I've got some important instructions here. I got instructions for the midterm, and I've got an updated schedule. So I'm going to look at that with you really quick. Here are the instructions for the midterm. This is due September 8th. So this week, there's only this one lecture, and then there's no class or no second lecture. Instead, just work on your midterm. Here's the instructions. In your practicum, you have proposed doing something for the common good. Now, I want you to justify it. Why is your project just, and how does it promote justice? You need to provide 2 philosophical justifications for your project. For example, you could offer a utilitarian justification and a libertarian justification, or a justification based on the biblical conception of justice and an egalitarian justification. Pick 2 of the following perspectives. And these do not need to be your personal perspective. In fact, it might be really great if you pick some perspectives you don't agree with. That would help you become an educated person. Remember, to be educated is to be able to take an idea that you disagree with and explain it in a compelling way. In a way that those who do agree with it would say, wow, you put that better than I could put it myself. So to be educated means to be able to explain all kinds of perspectives, even those we disagree with. All right, so pick 2 of the following perspectives. The biblical conception of justice, as in the Old Testament and Jesus, the stuff that we read. Catholic social teaching, liberalism and or libertarianism. You can either do both of those or one of those, but either way it can only count as one of the perspectives. Utilitarianism, egalitarianism, and by which I mean Rawls, Aristotle and teleology, or communitarianism. And if you're going to do communitarianism, don't also do Catholic social teaching. And if you're going to do Catholic social teaching, don't also do communitarianism. You'll see why in a minute. For each perspective, write an argumentative essay. And this essay is going to do 3 things. Explaining, number 1, why from that perspective your project is just and how it promotes justice. For each perspective 2, write out at least 1 compelling objection to the perspective. And then 3, explain how someone with that perspective would respond to the objection. you will write a total of 2 essays. So in other words, let's say you picked utilitarianism and you decided to create a utilitarian justification for your project. That's a great idea. That's the first step would be to explain how, from a utilitarian perspective, your project is, let's say, maximizing the welfare of wherever you're doing your thing and how it's promoting justice. For each, but then you're going to want to say, what would a critic of utilitarianism have to say about your argument? Maybe they would say you're not valuing people correctly, or you're not taking rights seriously enough. So you need to explain the compelling objection against utilitarianism. Pick one. And then 3, explain how a utilitarian would respond to that objection. And you're going to do that twice. Once for 2 different perspectives. Each essay should be 2 to 3 pages long, depending on how big your handwriting is. You know who I'm talking to. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I don't judge you by your handwriting size. And remember, format correctly. Single space, one-sided, etc. Go back to the syllabus, to instructions for homework, and follow those formatting guidelines there. If you have any questions about the midterm, send me an email. Then also note that practicum step 3, the update is also due September 8th. So hopefully you're already well along on that. Maybe you're halfway done and you'll just finish up in the next few days. In the second half of this page, you'll see the schedule update. As I mentioned, we're done doing the philosophical heavy lifting. What we're going to do for the next 5 class periods is consider 5 different people or organizations that are working for the common good. If you were taking this class on the main campus, and if there wasn't COVID-19, you would go on field trips. We'd all meet up at a place in South Bend, and we'd meet the person who's doing something for the common good and learn about the organization. But since you can't do that, I'm going to bring interviews to you. By the way, the main campus also isn't making those visits this year because of COVID-19. And so they're asking me, they're like, how do you do it for your Westville students? And so actually our model is shaping them, which is kind of fun. That's more than you need to know. Sorry. Okay. Concision. Here we go. So days 11, 12, and 13, you can see here, I'm going to be distributing to you some readings for each of these days. There's no new assignment, though. Just read the readings, then watch my interview of the people. I'm going to interview first a guy named Mike Hotelling from Hope Ministries in South Bend. Then I'll be interviewing Reverend Heather Gormley of Tree of Life Immigration Legal Aid Clinic. And then I'll be interviewing Elizabeth Trudeau of Notre Dame on the issue of human trafficking. I'll have a little handout for you to fill out for each interview and turn in, and that's it. I'm trying to give you a little bit less work so that you can get further on your final paper. Note, see this note right here, this bold note? The original syllabus says practicum step 4, annotated bibliography, is due on September 15. This is wrong! It's a mistake. I left that there on accident from an earlier version of the syllabus, so just ignore that. After you turn in, well, you already turned in step 3. Did you? No. After you turn in step 3, there's nothing more due until the final paper. Sorry. Lastly, days 14 and 15, we're going to look at the Dorothy Day readings and the Jean Vanier readings. Those, I believe, are in your course packet. No. Well, some of them are in your course packet. Some of them are to be handed out. But if you look in your syllabus, you can see the readings and you can see the questions that go with them. They used to be days 11 and 12, respectively. Finally, on day 16, there's no class, there's no work, because you're going to be working on your final paper and your final exam. And that's going to be due to September 29th. Hopefully all of this is clear as mud, or clear as the sky over South Bend in February. If you have questions, let me know. Now let's get back to the topic for the day. Communitarianism. Communitarianism is a response to liberalism in general, and in particular to the liberalism of John Rawls, who we looked at last week. Liberalism believes that the individual by nature is free and autonomous. In contrast, communitarians argue that we as individuals belong to different levels of community, like family, clan, city, and country, and that we have obligations or responsibilities to each of these communities. Does that communitarian belief sound familiar? Does it ring a bell? Hopefully you're thinking to yourself, wait, that sounds like Catholic social teaching. Ding, 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 ding. If that's what you're thinking, good work. Catholic social teaching is in part a form of communitarianism. Both Catholic social teaching and communitarianism in general argue for the social nature of the self. Now, to jog your memory, I've got a quiz for you. A little self-diagnostic quiz. It's right here, box 1 of your handout. Just take a minute. What is the social nature of the self? See if you can answer that from memory. All right. Okay, check your answer. That's what I have. Social nature of the self. Individuals are by nature part of society, and they find their meaning and fulfillment through belonging to society. I'll say it again. Individuals are by nature part of society and find their meaning and fulfillment through belonging to society. If you have something like that, you're on the right track. If not, hopefully this quiz will prepare you for the next time. Sandel, the author of our book, turns out to be a communitarian. And so the last 2 chapters that you read for this class show us what he believes about justice. The first 8 chapters, he's arguing and explaining other perspectives that he in part disagrees or agrees with. But now we get to see what he thinks. So in this class, we're going to be considering Sandel's argument for communitarianism. We'll begin by looking at his list of moral responsibilities, categories of moral responsibilities. This is on page 225 if you want to look it up later. Sandel says there's 3 different categories of moral responsibility. There's natural duties, voluntary duties, and obligations of solidarity. And these are in your handout box 2. Natural duties, voluntary obligations, and obligations of solidarity. Natural duties are duties that we owe to all human beings. The people we like, the people we don't like, the people we know, the people we don't know. In other words, they are universal. For example, we have to respect the rights of others. Like, there's a guy over there named Peter. Hi, Peter. Hey, Peter, I've got to respect your right to not have me punch you in the face, right? That's one of your rights, right? I don't even like Peter, but I'm not allowed to punch him. I have to honor his right. And there's like another 6 million people in Indiana that I have no right to punch. I have to respect their right not to be punched. I never made a contract with them, though. I never signed a contract saying I promise not to punch y'all. I haven't even met most of them, right? Sandel would say these natural duties do not require consent. I'm obligated to fulfill these natural duties just by virtue of being a human living in human society. They're natural. Sandel summarizes like this: they are universal and they do not require consent. Natural duties are universal, they do not require consent. Second, there are voluntary obligations. These do require consent. These are the obligations and contracts we voluntarily enter into. Like, for example, hey, Peter, my toilet's clogged. Could you come plunge it? Could you come stick a snake in it and declog it? Sure, I'll do it. Okay, man, I'll pay you $2. Sounds good. Now, once I make a deal with Peter, I am now obligated to him. This obligation requires consent, though, right? Notice that it's not universal. I don't owe the other 6 million people in Indiana anything for clean, I don't expect them to all come and try to unclog my toilet at the same time. That would be impossible, right? So these types of responsibilities are not universal. They're particular. They are particular to the people with whom we make agreements and contracts with. Sandel summarizes these voluntary obligations as being particular and requiring consent. Particular and requiring consent. Sandel says there's actually one more category of moral responsibility. He calls these obligations of solidarity. Obligations of solidarity are a little bit like natural duties in that they don't require consent. We have to do them. We're obligated to do them, even though we didn't ever sign a paper or make an agreement to do them. And they're a little bit like voluntary obligations in that they're not universal. They're particular. In this case, they're particular to the various communities to which we belong. They don't require consent. They're particular. They're obligations we feel to the various communities we belong to. For example, you might feel an obligation to your mother. You might feel an obligation to honor her and give her dignity through the choices you make in life. Now, we don't feel this obligation to our mom because we signed an agreement, right? When I was in my mother's womb, I didn't say, "Hey, Mom, if you give birth to me and you raise me, I promise to take good care of you and to do things that honor and dignify you when I'm grown up." No, we don't make a contract with our mother, yet we still are obligated. So it does not require consent. But these kind of obligations are not universal, right? We don't feel this obligation to everyone. We feel this obligation to particular people with whom, or particular communities with whom we belong. So those are obligations of solidarity. If you want to read more about these, they're on pages 223 through 225. Let me pause, though, and ask a question. This is going to be reflection in box 3. Do you feel such obligations of solidarity? It could be an obligation to a family member, or to your home, or to your country. If so, describe an obligation of solidarity you feel. If you don't feel such an obligation, I want you to explain to me why. Why do you think you don't feel any of these obligations? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to answer this question. Go ahead and write an answer. Okay, about 1 minute. Go ahead and finish up that last sentence, that last thought. Importantly, this is where Sandel and the communitarians disagree with the liberals and the libertarians. Liberals and libertarians don't recognize obligations of solidarity as being morally binding. They only recognize the first two categories of moral responsibility, natural duties and voluntary obligations. Now, this is not to say liberals and libertarians don't love their mothers and don't love their country. No, they probably feel a profound love and maybe even an obligation to help out their mothers. But they wouldn't take those feelings to be morally binding. It's nice to take care of your mother and bring her honor, but only if you choose to do so. If you choose not to care for or honor your mother, well, you might be rude and self-centered and a big disappointment, but you're not technically acting unjustly because you never agreed to care for her in the first place. Sandel and the communitarians, in contrast, would say, what? You're not just rude, self-centered, and a huge disappointment and a loser. You are acting unjustly. You're failing to do the right thing. You are morally obligated to care for and honor your mother because of your obligation of solidarity with her. To help us understand why this is so, Sandel describes the narrative conception of the self. Let me discuss this with you. If you notice here in your handout, there's questions 2, 3, and 4 all deal with the narrative conception of the self. Now, if we were just meeting and I said, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself, what would you tell me? Most of you would probably tell me where you're from, the city or state or country you came from. And you'd probably tell me about your family, perhaps your parents or your cousins or your children. At the beginning of this summer quarter, in the first handout, I asked you to tell me about yourself, and none of you described yourself as autonomous individuals, isolated individuals independent from all community obligations. You might have said you like being alone, but that's a different situation. In that handout, I asked you specifically where you're from. But I doubt that any of you were surprised by that question. It's a perfectly natural and normal thing to ask when you're first meeting someone, because where you came from is fundamental to your identity. Places like Muncie, Lafayette, Chicago, Monroeville, Angola, Indianapolis, Richmond, Spencerville, Kokomo, North Carolina, and Malawi. These aren't random places. They're part of your identity. Moreover, as I've read your practicum proposals, many of you would like to do something that benefits the town or community from which you came. Billy, for example, wants to do something about prisons in Malawi. Well, why Malawi? I mean, why not Portugal or South Korea? That's a dumb question, right, Dr. Gormley? Billy's from Malawi. But why is it a dumb question? It's dumb because where we come from is obviously part of our identity. It's not a random fact that bears no influence on our lives. In that handout, you also, without being prompted, many of you told me about your families. You told me about children or nieces and nephews or parents or grandparents. Some of you told me about the schools you went to. Sandel would say all of this is evidence of the narrative conception of the self. Now, what is the narrative conception of self? I'll get there. The fuller answer is this, but I'll give you a short one in a minute. The way we make sense of our lives is through storytelling. When we want to explain who we are as individuals, we tell a story. And our story is embedded in larger stories, the story of our family, the story of our community and town, the story of our country. We can't tell our own story without mentioning the other stories in which our story takes place. Moreover, we want our stories to be coherent. We want them to make sense. We want to make sense of our past. We look back at all the stuff that's happened to us, all the stuff that we've done, and we use storytelling to make sense of it. And when we look into the future, we want the end of our story to make sense. We want it to fit with what has come before. When something horrible happens to us, something that ruins our story, we lose our identity. We flounder around for a while. We get our identities back when we construct a new story that tries to make sense of the horrible stuff that happened. In short, here's the narrative conception of the self. Individuals define themselves through storytelling. And these stories involve the communities we belong to. I'll say it again. Individuals define themselves through storytelling, and these stories involve the communities we belong to. Sandel argues that the narrative conception of the self helps us make sense of the obligations we feel to the communities in which our story takes place. This brings us to the question number 3. How does the narrative conception of the self make sense of our feelings of obligations of solidarity? We feel obligations to our parents, our grandparents, whoever raised us. We feel obligations to our siblings, our children, our significant others. Sometimes we feel indebted to our hometowns and our communities. You know, when I was in the 4th grade, I came from a small barrio in Los Angeles called San Pedro. And in the 4th grade, I got this cool award. Was it 4th grade? Yeah. Called the Future Leader of San Pedro. The city commerce department gave me this award. They tapped me and they said, "You're going to be a future leader of our town." And then you know what happened? I left. I still feel bad about it. I go visit, but I'm not a leader of that town. I don't live there. I haven't lived there in 16 years. Right? But I feel a little bit of an obligation to my hometown. Maybe some of you do too. Sometimes we feel an obligation to our country. Sandel would argue that the reason we feel these obligations is because our story is embedded within the stories of these communities. Our story. And our story and our identity depends upon these communities. In a real sense, we have obligations or responsibilities to these communities. So Sandel again would say, the reason we feel these obligations is because our story is embedded within the stories of these communities. Our story and our identity depends upon these communities. And in a real sense, we have obligations and responsibilities to these communities. Next, Sandel says that the narrative conception of the self also helps us make sense of the sense of pride and shame we get from the communities to which we belong. Why do we take pride in our parents when they succeed? And why do we feel shameful when they fail? My dad had his mix of successes and failures. Throughout his life, his big hobby was travel. He traveled all over the U.S. multiple times, and he traveled to 114 countries, all of the continents except Antarctica. He's traveled a ton. He tried one time hitchhiking from California all the way to the tip of South America. Unfortunately, he only got as far as Panama City. The The truck that he was hitching a ride in drove off the road and crashed, and he was hospitalized for a few months. But he had already traveled the length of Central America. I'll tell you another story. My dad famously walked the coast of California. That's over 700 miles on foot. He did this in segments over a span of 18 years. I actually was dragged along part of this when I was a newborn. I was carried, I should say, over the Oregon border on the last little leg. But he walked the whole coast of California. Who does stuff like that? I'll tell you another story. He famously was put on trial for piracy. He was a pirate. A real pirate. How many people can say their dad was a pirate? My dad pirated a boat. It was an old river boat that was abandoned or left on the mud flats of the Sacramento River in California. And my dad and some buddies got a tugboat and towed it up to the city of Sacramento to donate it so that it would be preserved. And in fact, it is preserved. If you go to Sacramento today, the ship, the Delta King, is still there. It's now like a hotel and restaurant. But because someone else, thought it was their boat, I guess it technically was their boat, they, charged my dad with piracy. I tell you these stories because I think they're pretty cool. I see these as my dad's kind of cool success stories. He didn't, by the way, he was acquitted, not guilty of piracy. Uh, anyway, I take a lot of pride in my dad's kind of adventurous accomplishments. Why do I do that? My dad also had his share of failures. He never made it financially. I kept waiting for him to make it financially. He always struggled to make an income. When I was a kid, it was very common for him to work 2, 3, or even 4 jobs. One summer, his 4th job was delivering phone books door to door. We never seemed to make it. And as a kid growing up, I was embarrassed because I saw a bunch of other families where, the dad and the mom made a lot of money. And I always felt like maybe we weren't as good as them. I felt embarrassed that my dad wasn't so successful on the job front. He kept leaving jobs, starting new jobs, multiple jobs. Now, why do I feel shame and pride towards my dad? Well, our stories and our identities are wrapped up in each other. To put it poetically, I am in him and he is in me. Sandel and the Communitarians would say those feelings of pride and shame are not morally arbitrary, but are indicators of real obligations that my father and I owe to each other. We could tell the same story of America. For those of you who are American, I see you, Billy. I haven't forgotten about you. Do you ever feel pride in America? Do you ever feel embarrassed by America? I want you to do a little reflection again. I'm going to give you a minute. Look on the next page. Is there anything about your country's history that you are proud of? And is there anything about your country's history you are ashamed of? It's your turn. Go ahead and take a minute to answer these questions. Okay, go ahead and pair up with the person next to you and share your answers. Share your answers. Is there anything about your country's history you're proud of? Is there anything you are ashamed of? Go ahead and pair up and share answers. Okay, it's about 1 minute, so go ahead and make sure both people have a chance to talk. Don't hog the conversation. I see you. Don't do that. Okay, let's come back together. I felt both love for my country and shame for my country, or pride and shame for my country. Our country is one of the greatest countries in the world. And in all of history, I take pride in our great accomplishments. Like, we're one of the first modern democracies in the world. I also take pride in the fact that we defeated the Nazis in World War II. And I take pride in the fact that we were the first country to land a man on the moon. I also love American ingenuity. We've created many of the best inventions of the modern world, from the incandescent light bulb to air conditioning to computers. I mean, that's pretty awesome. We're a pretty awesome country. But I've also felt shame. I'm embarrassed, for example, by our long history of slavery and racism. And I'm ashamed of our treatment of Native Americans. When I think of the Trail of Tears, I think that's one of the most shameful things any country has ever done. And yet, it paved the way for American prosperity. Notice, however, I don't feel shame when I hear about the failures of other countries, right? You know, for example, I remember when I learned about the French massacre of the Haitians in Haiti. Or I remember when I first learned about the Japanese rape of Nanjing. When I heard of these horrible atrocities, I was sad and I was angry, but I didn't feel shame. It's not the same as when my country does something terrible. The same is true of pride. When I hear about the exploits of other countries, think of like the USSR, we beat them to the moon, but they were the first to put a man in space. Or when I think of like famous things like the Chinese, inventing paper. These things are cool and impressive, but I don't feel a sense of pride about them. They are my fellow human being. I could say, hey, I take pride in the accomplishments of all human beings. But the truth is, I feel more pride when it's Americans accomplishing things. And I feel shame in a way I don't feel when other countries commit atrocities. Now, why is that? Sandel would say, this is because I belong to my country. I belong to it in a way I don't belong to the other countries. And this belonging also comes with a real obligations of solidarity to my home country that are morally binding. What do you think about that? So that's what communitarianism argues for the existence of obligations of solidarity based on the narrative conception of the self. Now we need to test to see if it's true or not. We need to test to see if it's compelling or not. So I'm gonna offer a few examples. Now, do you guys need a break? If you need a break before we test out communitarianism, see if it works, you could pause the video, go refresh yourself, and come back in 5 minutes. I'm going to let you have that break if you need it. I'm just going to stand here and smile. Pause if you need to. Okay. You either took a break or you didn't. I don't know what you did, but I'm going to keep talking now. We're going to try out a few examples to test whether obligations of solidarity are morally binding or not. Morally binding in the same sense as those natural duties and those voluntary contracts we looked at. So the first example we're going to look at is immigration. What would be a just or the most just immigration policy possible? A communitarian would argue like this. The most just immigration policy is the one that would help Americans flourish. This might mean keeping all immigrants out of our country. It might not. Maybe it would mean letting a lot in. What would matter, though, is, are Americans flourishing? Let's suppose that research proves that American flourishing depends upon us excluding immigrants. The communitarian would say, we have to close the borders. It doesn't matter if outside of the border there are millions of people in economic peril, millions of people who would love to have a job in the US. It doesn't even matter if there's thousands of people at the door fleeing violence and oppression as refugees and asylum seekers. Well, it's nice that they're there, but we need to take care of America first. A communitarian would say the American government should take care of America before it thinks about caring for people from other countries. We Americans have an obligation of solidarity towards other Americans, which we need to fulfill before we take on the concerns of non-Americans. So that would be a communitarian argument for immigration policy, for an immigration policy. Contrast this with the libertarian position. Oh, by the way, you can read about this in box 5. My bad. What would be the libertarian position? Well, consider libertarian Alex Noresta, Norasta of the Cato Institute. You know, the Cato Institute, one of that big libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C. Alex Norasta argues for open borders. He says we should screen out criminals, terrorists, and those with chronic illnesses. But other than that, anyone who wants to come to America should be able to come. The only requirement is that the immigrants sign a waiver waiving their right or claim to any American social services. If they sign that, then they're free to come in and find work if they can. What? How is that a libertarian perspective? It sounds like, I don't know, crazy liberal propaganda or something. Well, remember, for a libertarian, governments exist to protect rights, enforce contracts, and promote the free market. When the government arbitrarily blocks workers from one country coming to our country for work, the government is interfering with the free market. If a business owner wants to hire an immigrant, who cares? What business is that of the government? The government should stay out of the labor market. Norasta argues, let the free market decide how many immigrants should get jobs in the U.S., not some arbitrary government policy. If 10 million immigrants come over here and find jobs, then great. That's 10 million open jobs that are now filled. If some of them can't find jobs, well, then they'll have to go somewhere else. And by the way, they do. In America today, the demand for immigrant labor goes up and down. And when it goes down, a lot of people go back across the border the other direction. So why is the government getting involved in this? Let the market handle questions like how many immigrants should be employed in the U.S. How do you feel about this idea? If you're opposed to open borders, as described by Norasta, you probably aren't a libertarian. If, for example, you're like, wait, what about the Americans that might lose jobs to immigrants? Right? If you're concerned about other fellow Americans losing their jobs, you're not thinking like a libertarian, you might be thinking like a communitarian. Again, if you think America first, that's a communitarian position. So that's our first test to see whether you find, so that's kind of a test of compellingness, I should say. Here's another example to think about. Buying American, right? This is one of President Trump's favorite lines, right? Buy American. When given the choice, should we try to buy products produced by American companies before buying them from China, for example? A communitarian would say, yeah. To take it to a lower level, maybe you've heard the phrase buy local. Buy local. What I like about this is buy American tends to get associated with the right side of politics. Buying local maybe sometimes gets associated with the left side of politics, but actually both of them are communitarian instincts. So buying local. If your neighbor owns a hardware store that's struggling to stay in business, should you buy tools from your neighbor, even if it costs you more? Or should you just go to Walmart or Home Depot and save money? Or suppose your neighbor owns a bookstore, a struggling bookstore. Should you buy books from your neighbor? Again, probably spending a little bit more money, probably not having a great selection. Or should you buy them from Amazon.com? A communitarian would say buy local. Why? You have obligations of solidarity to your local community. Your local community should come first to big giant companies. Let me take it down to an even lower level. How about the level of the family? Do we have an obligation to family that doesn't, again, require consent? I've recently picked up the hobby of canoeing in the St. Joseph River. I live really close to the river, and I can drag my canoe down to the river and then paddle around in it. It's really fun. Imagine you were in a canoe with a stranger and your daughter. And you're not in the St. Joseph River. You are in the middle of Lake Michigan. Bad idea, but let's just say you're doing that. Suddenly, a storm arises and the waves begin to rock the canoe. Then a huge wave comes and splashes the stranger, knocks the stranger and your daughter out of the boat. And they're both going to drown. But you can only save one of them. In a split second, you have to decide whom you're going to save. Do you save the stranger or do you save your daughter? Or does it even matter? Perhaps you only have an obligation to save one of the two, but it doesn't matter which person you save. After all, your daughter's life and your stranger's life, the stranger's life, are equally valuable. Neither person deserves to be saved more than the other, and neither person deserves to be drowned more than the other. In this situation, should you be unbiased? Should justice be blind? Or should you show a preference for your daughter? And if you show a preference for your daughter, is that wrong? Is that preference to save your daughter unjust? A communitarian would say, heck no. Family comes first. You have an obligation of solidarity with your daughter that is morally binding. You must care for your family first before thinking about those outside of your family. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to reflect on these examples. You can see this in box 6. Consider one of the examples, the immigration policy I was talking about, open borders or not. Buying local was another example, and then there was the daughter in the canoe. For the example you choose one of these examples. For the example you choose, do you agree with the communitarian perspective? Why or why not? And I'm going to give you a chance to discuss this too. So pick one of those situations, one of those examples, and explain why or why not you agree with the communitarian perspective. Okay, finish up your sentence or your thought. All right, after you finish that last thought, go ahead and pair up with someone and share your thoughts. Do you agree with the communitarian perspective on one of these examples? Why or why not? All right, let's come together here. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this. Um, our last question for today is, what is Sandel's argument for Aristotelian style public conversation and debate about the human telos and the good? And this will be, if you look at box 7, I have some space. We can look at a 4-step argument. So Sandel thinks that once we take the communitarian perspective seriously, maybe even if we don't agree with it fully, once we take it seriously and we realize, wow, obligations of solidarity, they are binding, or they might be binding, or wow, they have strength. They have some strength. Once we take this perspective seriously, he thinks this should drive us to Aristotelian style public conversation and debate about human telos and the good. That's kind of a jump. So how do you get from, wow, okay, I think I want to save my daughter's life over a stranger, to we should have Aristotelian conversation about the good, about teleology. Okay, so here's how it goes. A little complicated. Remember, for liberals like John Rawls, this is again who Sandel is arguing with. For liberals, when we come into the public square, when we want to discuss ideas, whether that be when politicians are campaigning, or when they're giving speeches, or when we're arguing about stuff in class, the liberal would say we should leave behind our identities and our particular communities. We should try to be as neutral as possible. We should not impose our values and our beliefs on each other. Remember that? Remember liberals and liberalism as well as libertarianism, right? Each person should choose their own good, do whatever is right in their own lot, in their own eyes. We want a secular government. We want a government that doesn't impose a morality or a particular religion on anybody. Right? That's the liberal dream, right? A secular government and individuals who try to come into the public square neutrally, um, leaving behind our particular identities and communities, right? Sandel thinks that the communitarian perspective shows us that this is not only impossible, it's undesirable. Because who are we as individuals? We are actually members of communities. We belong to families. We belong to religious groups. We belong to schools, organizations, higher level communities. And these communities put responsibilities on us, put obligations on us that are morally binding. So when we come into the public square, we shouldn't try to be neutral. We need to come as people who belong to different, meaningful communities. Communities that give us our identity. Okay? You kind of see where this is going? Let me give you kind of a 4-step argument now. Let me break it down into 4 steps. You can call this, again, Sandel's argument for an Aristotelian-style public conversation and debate about human telos and the good. First, when we as society want to figure out what is just, or what justice looks like, what is the right thing to do, we need to enter into public conversation and debate. I'll say that again. When we as a society want to figure out, what justice looks like, we need to enter into public conversation and debate. Pretty simple. Second, when we do this, though, we should not try to leave behind our identities and communities, nor our values and belief systems. When we enter into public conversation and debate, I'll say it again, we should not try to leave behind our identities and communities, nor our values and belief systems. By the way, Sandel would say, it's probably impossible to leave behind our identities and communities. What would he even mean to be a blank, identity-free individual? I mean, that's like a robot. So number 1, when we want to figure out what justice looks like, we need to enter into public debate and conversation. Number 2, when we do this, we should not try to leave our identities, communities, values, and belief systems behind. They are an inherent part of us. Number 3, we should not expect the government to be neutral towards the good. We should not expect the government to be neutral towards the good. In other words, the government can't say, oh, we're not going to promote one morality over another. We're not going to promote one value system over another. No. Remember the lecture from Aristotle. The government is always promoting some kind of morality, always promoting some kind of good. Neutrality turns out to be nearly impossible. In chapter 10, Sandel gives the examples of abortion rights and gay marriage. It's basically impossible to determine the justness of abortion or the justness of gay marriage without getting into religious and teleological questions like, when does a human life have personhood? When does a human life have rights? When does a human life deserve equal dignity to all other human life? Now, you can't answer that question without getting into religious and teleological questions. Or what about gay marriage? You can't decide if gay marriage is just or not unless you first ask the question, what's the purpose or what's the telos of marriage? A liberal secular government can't answer these questions without imposing values and beliefs on society as a whole. So again, the third point is this: we shouldn't expect the government to be neutral towards the good. Step number 4. Since neutrality cannot be achieved, following the example of Aristotle, we should instead enter into public conversation about the human telos and the good. Since neutrality cannot be achieved, following the example of Aristotle, we should instead enter into public conversation and debate about the human telos and the good. In other words, since we can't keep morality and belief systems and value systems out of the government, we should argue and think and talk and debate about morality and belief systems and values, rather than trying to keep those out bay. I'm going to pretend I'm actually not a Christian so that we can come up with some kind of policy, or I'm going to pretend like I'm actually not an atheist and we're going to come up with some kind of agreement, or I'm going to pretend like I'm not actually a Muslim, right? That would be the liberal ideal. Sandel would say, no, neutrality is not going to be achieved either either in the government, number 3, or number 2, as individuals. So following the example of Aristotle, we should enter into public conversation and debate about human telos and the good. The final takeaway is this: while we won't always agree, through thoughtful conversation and debate, we will create a society in which our agreements outnumber our disagreements. While we won't always agree, I'll say it again, through thoughtful conversation and debate, we will create a society in which our agreements outnumber our disagreements. And here's the Aristotelian bonus: we will grow in virtue as we become people who know how to carry out good, thoughtful conversation and debate. We will grow in virtue as we become people who know how to carry out good, thoughtful conversation and debate. So that's Sandel's argument for Aristotelian style public conversation and debate about the human telos and the good. Once we realize the communitarian perspective, that we find our identities, we find our meanings, we find our responsibilities through belonging to these communities. It becomes obvious that we can't be neutral, that in fact we need to bring our perspectives, our moralities, our beliefs into the public square so we can talk about them. All right, box 8. Last thing I want you to do is take 2 minutes. What do you want to remember from today's lecture? Go ahead and write out an answer. About 40 seconds. Okay, finish up your last sentence and your last thought. All right. Well, remember that on September 9th, this handout is due plus, sorry, September 8th. How did I get that date wrong? Yeah, sorry. September 8th, the Tuesday, this handout is due, plus the midterm. Remember, the instructions are on the back, plus the practicum step 3. And then for the coming class sessions, next week, you've got the updated schedule. What I want you to do is sometime in the next 30 minutes, as soon as possible, go back to these 5 questions of the day and try to answer complete answers to these questions without using your notes. And then if that's too difficult, try using your notes. If it still doesn't make sense, talk to a classmate. And then also, please let me know. Again, the reason why I do this is the sooner you review, research shows that the sooner you review class material, the better you comprehend it, and the longer you comprehend it, the quicker you comprehend it. So that's my last charge to you. I look forward to reading your midterms and your practicum step 3s. So I will see you next week. Blessings.